Good day, everyone. Today, we will be having the topic When I Was a Child, I Spake as a Child, reflecting on the limits of a nationalist language policy by DVS Manaparpaak. This examines the limits of the nationalist language policy in the Philippines, which is aimed to dislodging English from its privileged position in the controlling linguistic domains. Following the suspect adaptation of Filipino aka Tagalog as a national language in the 1987 Constitution, the Philippines has witnessed a resurgence of nationalist rhetoric in defense of the privileging of one of the country's more than 80 languages as the de jure lingua franca, to the extent that English in the Philippines has evolved into a distinct variety. The essay advocates its institution as sole official language of the country, even as it urged the maintenance of the vernaculars, including Tagalog, as integral part of the Filipino people's multicultural heritage. Unlike Tagalog, which is viewed with skepticism by other ethnologic groups, which English has established itself as an indispensable medium of social and intellectual exchange and a legitimate vehicle of the Filipino people's vision. So now let us go to the historical background. The Philippines is an archipelago that consists of some 7,100 islands and boasts more than 80 languages. That the Filipinos need a language in which to communicate with one another is an imperative recognized by everybody. The first attempt to formulate linguistic policy came at the height of the Philippine War of Independence from Spain, which coincided with the Spanish-American War. The so-called Malolos Constitution of 1898 spelled out a provisory language policy that adopted Spanish as official language of the country, even as it provided for the optional use of languages spoken in the Philippines. 1899 Constitution Title 14 Article 93. The Philippines, of course, did not become independent in the aftermath of that war but was called by Spain to the USA. The new colonizers in turn promptly implemented their own agenda, which included the teaching of English, its use as medium of instruction, and its adaptation in other public domains, particularly in government, commerce, and trade, when the status of the colony was changed into that of a commonwealth in 1935. The Philippines drafted a new constitution which provided for the continued use of English and Spanish as official language, while Congress took steps toward the development and adaptation of a common national language based on one of the existing native languages. In 1935 Constitution, Article 14, Section 3. This marked the birth of the idea of a national language that was expected to unify Filipinos after they received their independence from the USA in 1940. It is important to note that the original wish of the delegates to the 1934 Constitutional Convention was to craft a language based on all indigenous languages, an undertaking which was admittedly formidable in nature, but was cognizant of the multilingual character of the soon-to-be independent republic. But as history would have it, the nationalist delegates won the upper hand, and 3 years later, in 1937, President Manuel Quezon, who had earlier negotiated the date of the Philippine independence, proclaimed Tagalog as the sole basis of the national language. After that, one arbitrary move led to another. In 1940, the Department of Education decided to start teaching the national language in the senior year of high school, even before the language could actually develop and become recognizably distinct from ordinary Tagalog as spoken in the region. In 1946, the still nameless national language became a compulsory subject at all levels of primary and secondary education. Finally, in 1959, Secretary Jose Romero of the Department of Education took the liberty of naming the national language Filipino in a desperate attempt to create at least a nominal difference between the regional language Tagalog and the phantom national language. Tagalog suffered a temporary setback in 1973 when a new constitution reverted to the original 1935 idea of developing national language based on all the languages in the Philippines. Ironically, this came as a result of President Ferdinand Marcos' usurpation of political power and subsequent tampering with the constitution to lend legitimacy to his unlawful regime. The new constitution gave the national language a new name, Filipino, with an F, but provided for the continued use of Filipino with a P, and English as official language of the country until otherwise provided by law, 1973 Constitution Article 15, Section 3. Despite of the tacit admission that Filipino was really Tagalog, the Department of Education adopted a bilingual policy of instruction a year later, which provided for the teaching of social science subject in Filipino and the natural sciences and mathematics in English. Finally, after Marcos fled in the Philippines in 1986, the new constitution that came into force simply assumed that the national language Filipino already existed and that the government could now promote its use as language of instruction in the educational system. In 1987 Constitution, Article 14, Section 6. In truth, however, the framers of the 1987 Constitution simply dissolved the distinction between Filipino, aka Tagalog, and the still to be developed Filipino. Thus, Tagalog was catapulted on the status of national language, while English is now in danger of losing its official language status with an exasperation that many people in the Philippines must share. One Filipino scholar has criticized that last language policy pronouncement as a classic case of creating a language by fiat or gobbledygook. Let us proceed to nationalism and the national language question. As already alluded to, historical developments have twice forced a foreign language down the Filipinos' throats, and the atrocities committed by the foreign powers that subjugated the country in different periods of its history have been etched in the Filipinos' collective psyche. The desire to discard the linguistic legacies of colonialism and to promote the indigenous languages in their stead has therefore been part of the parcel of the Filipino struggle for freedom itself. The struggle to free the country from the shackles of colonial rule has also been a struggle to free the minds of the people from their enslavement to foreign languages. As defensible as the intention is, it is not a license to skirt the issues of ethno-linguistic diversity. In spite of what nationalists would want everyone to believe, the Filipinos did not become a nation when they finally received their independence from the USA in 1946. On Independence Day, there were to a large extent as diverse as the Spanish colonizers had found them in 1521. Their common experience of exploitation and injustice under Spanish, the Americans, and for a brief period of the Japanese notwithstanding, the Filipinos have remained culturally distinct from one another, speaking a variety of languages, practicing a number of religions, and observing different customs and traditions. Allegiance to the now independent republic demands of a high degree of transcendence of ethno-linguistic boundaries, but not their permanent erasure. The clamor for a national language is therefore nothing more than wishful thinking, like the Philippine flag, national anthem, national costume, and so on. The national language is a mere symbol that begs the question of the existence of Filipino nation. Florian Kolmas sees the quest for a national language in third world countries as a response to the existence of national languages in Europe and their symbolic significance for national integrity. He is, however, quick to call attention to the quintessential difference between late 18th century Europe and post colonial Asia and sub Saharan Africa. Herein lies the crux of the problem in the Philippine language policy. The Philippines is a linguistically plural society whose political unity is a result of colonial machinations. Spain determined the extent of its Pacific colony in the 16th century and spelled out its boundaries in the deed of sale that it is signed with the USA 3 centuries later. For good or for bad, the boundaries of the Philippines have not been redrawn since then. Already burdened with economic difficulties that form the legacy of some 400 years of colonialism. Various administrations have tried to safeguard the integrity of the Philippines through the promotion of the national language. For all the good intentions, the move owes much to an antiquated European notion and plays into the hands of a small group of Filipino nationalists. Thus, Wilfredo Villacorta, who played a key role in the 1987 constitutional hat-trick, regrets the arguments of European nationalists in the late 18th century when he insists on an organic tie between language and thought. National pride is best expressed in the national language because the latter carries with it the sentiments of the thought processes that would otherwise not be captured when one uses a foreign language, according to Wilfredo Villacorta. As is often the case with nationalist rhetoricians, Villacorta's obsession with national unity and cultural autonomy narrows his perspective so that he begins to propagate a restrictive identity politics that views the adaptation of one indigenous language as prerequisite to Filipino nationhood. To be sure, most Filipino scholars recognize that Filipino at most serves a symbolic function. Andrew Gonzalez, for instance, aware of the failure of the country's bilingual education policy, separates the issues of language from nationalism. According to Gonzalez, nationalism assumes many indicators and cannot be stereotyped into preference for medium of instruction in school or even competence in the selected national language. Thus, a linguistic symbolic of unity and national identity will not necessarily entail an eagerness to use the languages for education, especially when there is a competing dominant second language that is still present to give material incentives and other instrumental reasons for acquisition. It is unfortunate, however, that Gonzalez eschews the issue of why Filipinos need a national language in the first place. But, at least, he is aware that allegiance to the state is not manifested in the mastery of national language alone. More importantly, he acknowledged the multiplicity of factors that determine language choice. The nagging question about the necessity for a national language remains. If it does not really foster unity among different ethno-linguistic groups, nor make a significant contribution to the process of learning, what is it for? In the case of the Philippines, where the question has more or less boiled down to choosing between Tagalog and English as the sole official language of the country, nationalists like Villacorta have ready answer. So, according to Villacorta, the national language Filipino also serve as a defense against foreign cultures that employ their own language to smoother the growth and independence of the developing nation. Clearly, such an objection to be continued use of English in the Philippines has to do with a fear that Filipinos will begin to imbibe Anglo-American values. If they have not done so already, again, echoing European romantics, Villacorta insists that every language is a culture laden. English carries with the Weltanschauung of its native speakers, according to Villacorta. Here is a clear exemplification of natural anxiety. The belief that a foreign language could actually erode local culture and value is, at best, an outmoded paradigm that had some legitimacy in the early stages of decolonization. Following a simplistic casualty, it disregards a host of variables that determine which values a particular society adopts at which point in its history. Worse, such a deterministic view assigns cut and dried roles to the source of culture as all powerful and pernicious, and the recipient culture as a highly permeable and passive. Let us go to linguistic imperialism. This grand design is elaborated on by Robert Philipson in this comprehensive work Linguistic Imperialism during 1992, which focuses on the dramatic spread of English especially in the last century. The book sets out to expose the ideological underpinnings of English language teaching, or ELT, and examines the roles of the various institutions implicated in the linguistic power play with clear Manichean poles. On the one hand, there is a centralized center suggested by the use of the capital letter, which consists primarily of the UK and the USA and institutions that are more or less affiliated with them, including the US Information Agency, the British Council, and the Peace Corps, the Rockefeller Foundation, the IMF, the World Bank, Hollywood, and the internet, and etc. The center or the century, the book argues advances its own interests through financial aid and the export of material and human resources. On the other hand, there is the very free or very fry, also capitalized and singular, which consists mainly of or former colonies that are unable to distinguish what is good for them and what is not. It ends up infused with the norms and values of the center or the century and languishing in a state of a protracted cultural dependence. This, in turn, is a precondition for the economic exploitation and domination of the periphery of by the century, to the extent that Philipson employs his theoretical framework to describe both the colonial and the neo-colonial situations. One gets the impression that linguistic imperialism is an invulnerably closed system that is able to travel through time and across geographic space unchallenged and indeed unchanged. Except the history has shown time and again that any assertion of dominance is bound to elicit some form of resistance. It is in the respect that Philipson paradigm appears to the shortchange that verifies. Linguistic imperialism, according to him, works because the people involved in the promotion of English, including teachers, aid workers, government officials, policy makers, language planners, and so on, are for the most part either unaware of their complicity in the evil design of the century or are willing pawns in the intricate game of subjugation. Maintaining that English language more than a neutral instrument that can be used to achieve any particular need actual carries with the very blueprint of hegemonic world order by Philipson during 1992. He describes a complex scenario that has the governments of the peripheries along the local intelligence shall happily delivering their societies to the putative center. The development of Philippine English. Fortunately, there has never been a dearth of Filipino scholars that have adopted a more sober view of the persistent popularity of English in the Philippines. They recognize English as an indispensable medium of local exchange and appreciate its status as language of wider communication that enables them to participate in transnational knowledge production as active agents and not simply as objects of various theorizing. Maria Lourdes S. Bautista, for example, documents the development of a Philippine variety of English as evidence of a successful process of language appropriation. According to Ms. Bautista, in the year 2000, Philippine English is not English that falls short of the norms of standard American English. It is not badly learned English as a second language. Its distinctive features are not errors committed by users who have not mastered the American standard. Instead, it is nativized variety of English that has features which differentiate it from standard American English because of the influence of the first language, especially in pronunciation, although we should always keep in mind Straven's distinction between accent and dialect, but occasionally in grammar because of the different culture in which the language is embedded, expressed in the lexicon and discourse conventions, and because of our restructuring of the grammar rules manifested in the grammar, Philippine English has an informal variety, especially in the spoken mode, which may include a lot of borrowing and code mixing, and it has a formal variety which, when used by the educated speakers and found acceptable in educated Filipino circles, can be called Standard Philippine English. In effect, Bautista is arguing that the much feared transfer of norms, values, and ideology from the center of the peripheries has long ceased to be a reality in the Philippines. Her insistence on the role of culture and other locally locally situated variables bellies on any different manipulation of ELT to advance a hegemonic agenda of the putuative center. For their part, Bonifacio P. Sibayan and Andrew Gonzalez agree that the cultures of the peripheries have a way of frustrating the ideological thrust of the center. According to Sibayan and Gonzalez in 1996, what is fascinating from linguistic and cultural point of view are the adaptations of the language that is undergoes inculturation and the new ways in which this culturally grafted code is put to use to thematize entirely new phenomena, realities, and events. Cultural diffusion is never pure. It results in mixtures. Whatever you receive is received in the manner of the receiver, to quote an old medieval scholastic principle. As the code undergoes acculturation, it becomes different in many features and if left there longer, it will soon become a different code from its former source. So now, not only is the form of the transplanted language changed, therefore, by the way it is used, it is no longer dictated by the source culture. The prevailing conditions in the recipient culture give rise to an altogether different set of imperatives. The agents of the center can only do so much to implement their own grand design. In the end, the users of the language in the peripheries determine what normative features the transplanted language will adopt, for what purposes that language will be used, and whose ends it will ultimately serve. Again, observing how local imperatives have eventually influenced the lot of post-imperial English in the Philippines, Sibayan and Gonzalez make a statement in the direction of Philip's son. In our view, according to Sibayan and Gonzalez, linguistic imperialism on the use of English in the Philippines, it is a thing of the past. It was characteristic of an imperial period, which is colonial. The statements on the Philippines quoted by Philip's son in linguistic imperialism on the Philippines are those by an insignificant, biased minority. This is like flogging a dead horse. Today, Filipinos have taken over their own affairs, including what to do with English. The Filipinos today are doing with English what they want to do and not from any dictation of outsiders, which is foreigners. Philippine literature in English. For his part, Luis H. Francia uses a more combative language to underline the fact that Filipino writers in the English language are engaged in a counter-hegemonic resistance to the center's incursion into the cultures of the peripheries. According to Francia, in a sense, many of our Filipino writers in English are engaged in the literary equivalent of guerrilla warfare, using the very same weapon that had been employed to the foist underset of foreign values upon a ravished nation. But now, as part of an discernment for conscious self-determination in the unwieldy process of reclaiming psychic territory from the invader. Francia is particularly extolling the achievements of Filipino creative writers, who, in optioning to describe their experience and articulate their artistic vision in the English language, have wrested control of the signifying practice from the former colonizer. Let us go to the American Standard and Philippine English. The Philippine literature in English has failed to develop a sizable following outside academic is unfortunate enough. The problem is, however, aggravated by an improper diagnosis that puts the blame squarely on the language of choice. When Arnold Bolina Azurin remarks that English has failed to become the medium of the authentic cultural efflorescence in the Philippines and that it has served instead a sort of umbilical cord between the creative minds in the Philippines and Mother America, according to Azurin. He is ignoring the accomplishment of generations of Filipino writers who have claimed the English language as a legitimate vehicle of their own artistic vision. Coming 2 decades after Miguel Bernan's famous Constitution of the Philippine English Language Literature as perpetually hated. Azurin's statement is needed in anarchism that no longer reflects on the complexity of the present situation. At the core of such criticism are two fallacious notions rather. First is the chosen code, being alien to the Philippines, will never be able to fully express or depict the prevailing conditions in the country and the aspiration of its people. Second, should they insist on using language, Filipinos will have to subscribe to either the American or British standard. Let us proceed to inequality and English. More serious than the allegation of that English can never be made adequate to describe Philippine realities is the charge that English stratifies society, with English speakers forming an elite that enjoys a monopoly of material rewards, and in the process alienating themselves from the so-called masses. While it is true that Americans in the early years of colonization systematically implemented a program of training and development for a select group of Filipinos that would assist them in the gargantuan task of administering their newly acquired territory, and while it can also be argued that those Filipinos who studied in the USA and mastered the English language eventually occupied key positions not only in government but in economy of a country as well. Blaming social inequity and the Philippines on English is a way too convenient and dangerous. For one thing, it absolves the Filipino of their own culpability in the matter. Certainly, the deplorable quality of public education, the inegalitarian distribution of land, the limited employment opportunities, the rampant corruption in the government and the civil service, and the general perversion of democratic institutions are the real root of the problem. Replacing English with Tagalog, as nationalists have been insisting on, is not going to eliminate the problem. Those who already enjoy a monopoly of material resources will continue to dominate Philippines society, as they are the ones who can and will continue to afford expensive, high quality education and language training over mostly by private institutions. Meanwhile, native speakers of Tagalog will find themselves enjoying undue advantage in addition to their geographic proximity to the center of power. This, in turn, could incite feelings of envy, if not enmity, from other ethno-linguistic groups and exacerbate the problem. The conflicts is the Balkans, Central Africa, and Indonesia in the recent past should remind everybody of the disagreeable consequences of nationalist policies that place certain ethno-linguistic groups at a disadvantage. The Philippines is well advised to steer clear of policies that could translate into chauvinism, intrinsic animosity, and open violence. The only viable solution is to make high quality education available and accessible to the vast majority of the population. That means more schools, better infrastructure, more attractive compensation, and training programs for teachers and general revelation of school curricula and education policies. These are the real issues. These are the real challenges. So now let us have our conclusion. It is high time that the Philippine government re-examine its language policy and admitted that its aim to dislodge English from its privileged position in the controlling linguistic domains and make Tagalog the sole official language is a costly and decisive project devoid of any merit save perhaps for the symbolic triumph of ridding the Philippines of another colonial legacy. Instead of waxing romantic in anticipation of the day Filipinos would speak one indigenous language, nationalists are better off acknowledging the culture of the Philippines is the sum of a total different ethnicities, linguistic backgrounds, and foreign influences. The integrity of Philippine society is not necessarily guaranteed by language unity, let alone by the imposition of one indigenous language which is viewed with skepticism by other ethno-linguistic groups according to Hidalgo and Gonzales. A more pragmatic alternative is the adaptation of a two-pronged strategy that enhances the surviving indigenous languages in the country, even as it pushes for Philippine language as the primary means of communication among the different ethno-linguistic groups and as legitimate vehicle for their visions. The nationalist objection to the language is a matter of pride, false pride. More than half a century after the Philippines claimed its independence from the USA, there are still wailing over the legacies of colonialism. And V.M. Gonzales put his finger on the problem as early as the mid-1970s when they admonished the dictators of the English language in the Philippines to ask whether the despair is real or only an expression of self-flagellation. It is one thing to be critical and to resist attempts to hold up one nation, race, or belief as worthy of emulation, or promote inegalitarian relations between the sexes or among different social classes. It is an entirely different matter to wallow in cultural insecurity and nationalistic paranoia. Filipino nationalists will be doing themselves a huge favor by putting away their childish things. So I do hope that you have understand our topic today, but take note of this. The biblical quotation in the title is from 1 Corinthians 13:11. Second, all references to the Constitution of the Philippines are taken from the John Robles Virtual Law Library. Lastly, the author of the present chapter prefers the plural form to foreground the heterolingity of the territories classified under the totalizing label preferring and to acknowledge their ties to other cultural centers. So thank you for listening, for watching, and learning. God bless.